The galaxy had grown arrogant in humanity's absence. For centuries, the species from Sol was nothing more than a footnote in historical records, dismissed as primitive, fragile, and extinct. Their extinction was assumed, their absence noted, but ultimately irrelevant. Empires expanded, colonies flourished, fleets multiplied, and strategies were designed without the faintest consideration for the species that once called Earth home. It was a mistake that would cost the Trivax Alliance 10,000 vessels in less than a week. The first warning came as a transmission, garbled and incomplete, from one of the outermost human observation posts that had gone unnoticed for decades. They 10,000 approaching, only the signal cut out. By the time it reached the inner systems, the message was reduced to frantic fragments, barely intelligible, but enough to sow the first seeds of unease among the Alliance command, 10,000 vessels. Not a fleet, not a squadron, not a task force, 10,000 ships, assembled and advancing with a precision that was almost impossible to comprehend. The Trivax commanders scoffed initially. Perhaps a reconnaissance mission? Perhaps a rogue fleet from one of the lesser systems? They mobilized their armadas with the kind of confident arrogance only centuries of unchallenged dominance could breed. The armada stretched across light years, a river of steel and energy poised to sweep down on Earth like a tide of annihilation. Every vessel bristled with weapons capable of obliterating entire planets. Every crew trained to execute precise maneuvers. Every admiral proud of the strategic genius that had made this fleet the apex of galactic power. Meanwhile, on Earth, life went on as it always had. Cities pulsed with normalcy. Children ran through parks, laughing, entirely unaware of the vast, incomprehensible armada heading toward their planet. Scientists worked in laboratories, unraveling the mysteries of ancient star maps, probing energies older than any recorded civilization. Farmers tilled the soil, and markets hummed with trade. And yet, behind this veneer of ordinary life, humans prepared silently and deliberately, their technology and intelligence harnessed over centuries to anticipate every possible action of the galaxy that had long dismissed them. A first wave of Trivax vessels crossed the outer rim of Sol's gravitational influence. Thousands of massive warships moved with terrifying coordination, their weapons powered, their sensors sweeping the void for targets. The galaxy watched in awe at the sheer scale of the assault. Yet, as the armada advanced, the first anomalies appeared. Sensor arrays recorded disturbances in the fabric of space itself, warping, bending, fluctuating in impossible patterns. Communication networks scrambled. Navigation systems faltered. The very physics the Trivax fleet relied upon seemed to resist their advance. Admiral Calthor, commander of the flagship Erebus, peered at the readouts in disbelief. Status report. His officers scrambled to reconcile data that made no sense. Entire squadrons vanished from scanners, only to reappear in impossible positions. Energy weapons discharged prematurely or misaligned. Engines fluctuated without warning, and shields warped erratically. Calthor's voice, usually calm and commanding, was tinged with a rare uncertainty. This cannot be happening. Unknown to the Trivax, humanity had anticipated every step of their advance. Centuries of observation, study, and refinement had prepared humans for precisely this moment. They had watched as empires grew complacent, as arrogance flourished, as fleets amassed with reckless confidence. They had learned from ancient technologies older than the stars, relics of civilizations that had risen and fallen long before the first supernovas in recorded history. Humans had mastered patience, foresight, and the subtle art of inevitability. As the outermost vessels entered the Sol system, the first wave of disruption began. Navigation grids folded in on themselves, warping trajectories and causing collisions among ships that had previously moved with perfect precision. Energy weapons misfired, melting harmlessly against invisible fields. Propulsion systems faltered, leaving massive ships adrift in chaotic spirals. Thousands of crew members experienced vertigo, panic, and confusion as their ships betrayed the commands they had trusted their entire lives. The Armada's coordination began to unravel, and the first vessels were lost, not to attack, but to disorientation engineered by human mastery. The Trivax officers struggled to understand the phenomenon. "It's as if space itself is fighting us," muttered one navigator, panic creeping into his voice. Engineers worked feverishly, recalibrating systems, rerouting power, attempting to override the anomalies, but nothing worked. Every solution the Trivax devised was anticipated, countered, and neutralized by technology and strategy beyond comprehension. 10,000 vessels, the apex of Trivax power, were already suffering catastrophic losses, and yet the humans remained entirely undetected, entirely calm, entirely in control. Back on Earth, the human fleet remained invisible, spread across the system in strategic silence. Ships operated not with bluster or aggression, but with quiet precision. Autonomous drones monitored the Armada's approach. AI systems calculated outcomes decades in advance, and energy fields manipulated the very fabric of space to ensure the Trivax fleet would falter. Humans did not fire a single shot. They did not reveal themselves. They waited, observing the consequences of their centuries-long preparations unfold with meticulous accuracy. By the end of the first day, thousands of vessels had been neutralized. Ships collided with one another, energy weapons short-circuited, propulsion systems failed catastrophically, and crews faced the incomprehensible truth that their Armada 10,000 strong was disintegrating before their eyes without a single human attack. The galaxy began to murmur with disbelief. How could a species presumed extinct orchestrate the collapse of an entire Armada so efficiently, so invisibly, and so completely? Even among the survivors, morale collapsed. Officers could not reconcile what they saw with their training. Entire fleets had been rendered ineffective by forces they could not see or measure. Panic spread faster than fire across the command structures. And all the while, humanity remained silent, patient, and unyielding, their presence cloaked in ordinary normalcy. The planet itself remained unchanged, life proceeding as usual, while the galaxy's most powerful fleets were dismantled by anticipation, intelligence, and mastery of forces older than the stars. By nightfall, 10,000 vessels had been reduced to mere hundreds, drifting in chaos, immobilized or destroyed by accidental collisions. The first transmission reached the inner command centers, fragmented and terrified. We cannot fight them," only the message ended abruptly, leaving the galaxy in stunned silence. The Sol system was calm. Earth was unchanged. Humanity, it seemed, had returned not to fight, but to demonstrate something far more terrifying: inevitability. The first segment closed with one stark truth echoing across the stars. The galaxy had underestimated humans. They had prepared 10,000 vessels, confident in their supremacy. They had expected a battle of fleets, of weapons, of tactics, and instead, the Armada was collapsing, neutralized not by force, but by foresight, patience, and knowledge beyond comprehension. The universe would never make the same mistake again. Humanity had returned, and the galaxy was only beginning to understand what that meant. The second day of the campaign was when the galaxy truly began to grasp the magnitude of humanity's return. By now, thousands of the Trivax vessels had been rendered inoperative, drifting helplessly in space, their crews scrambling to understand the impossible. The Armada, which had advanced with the confidence of gods, had become a fragmented maze of confusion and panic. The human fleet, invisible and precise, had not even fired a single weapon. This was not warfare, as the galaxy had known it. This was a lesson in inevitability. At the outer edge of the Sol system, Admiral Calthor's flagship, the Erebus, shuddered violently as its engines misfired, thrusting the massive vessel into a slow spiral toward the nearest asteroid field. Sensors flickered and alarms screamed, a cacophony of chaos amplified by the immensity of the Armada's failure. Calthor's voice, usually calm and authoritative, rang with disbelief. "Explain this. I want answers." His officers' faces were pale, eyes wide with terror. Data streamed in from every ship, engines failing, shields collapsing, energy weapons misaligning, and navigation grids warping as if space itself had conspired against them. The fleet tried to regroup, issuing orders to correct their trajectories, to stabilize formations, to coordinate defensive maneuvers. But every command was anticipated, every adjustment nullified by unseen forces. Vessels collided in slow-motion disasters, entire squadrons spiraling into destruction or drifting into oblivion. The Trivax had trained their crews for every conceivable contingency, but not for patience, foresight, and technology older than the stars. Humans had anticipated the Armada's every calculation, counted every assumption, and manipulated the very fabric of space to their advantage. Amid the chaos, small pockets of surviving crews attempted to communicate with one another. The transmissions were frantic, filled with terror and confusion, as officers tried to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they had been taught. It's impossible. Nothing we do works." One lieutenant gasped into the comms. Others agreed, panic spreading faster than any virus. In hours, thousands of vessels were effectively neutralized without a single human attack, their immense power rendered irrelevant by foresight, patience, and the subtle mastery of space itself. Human observers, positioned strategically beyond the inner planets, watched the unraveling with clinical precision. Their fleet remained invisible, cloaked not just physically but temporally, projecting subtle gravitational manipulations, energy distortions, and navigational anomalies. Humans did not need to fire a shot. The Armada dismantled itself, obeying invisible forces, trapped by their own assumptions, arrogance, and ignorance. It was a demonstration of power that no other civilization had ever witnessed, a display of inevitability that would echo through history. By midday, the first dozen major battleships had collided catastrophically, creating cascading debris fields that disabled nearby vessels. Propulsion units overloaded, energy systems backfired, and weapon arrays misfired continuously, rendering entire squadrons incapable of offensive action. Reports from the surviving commanders were almost incomprehensible. Sensors had detected phantom fields of unknown origin, navigation grids had folded, and energy pulses behaved in ways that violated every known law of physics. Humanity's return was not just a military victory, it was a redefinition of what was possible in the cosmos. On the ground in command centers across Trivax space, panic spread through bureaucracies and command chains. Calculators, AI advisors, and war simulations all failed. Every prediction had assumed a conventional opponent, operating under conventional rules. Humanity did not operate conventionally. Their patience, their strategy, and their ancient technology were beyond calculation. Every fleet that had once inspired awe and fear now floated, impotent, like driftwood on a tidal wave, helpless against an unseen hand. Despite the horror, some Trivax officers attempted desperate tactics. Squadrons were rerouted, weapon systems recalibrated, new formations attempted, yet every maneuver was anticipated and rendered useless. Human AI calculated probabilities centuries in advance, predicting every potential response to every possible action. The Armada's mistakes were not random. They were inevitable, guided by intelligence and foresight older than the galaxy itself. The human's genius lay not in aggression, but in preparation. The survivors, the few ships that had not yet been disabled, struggled to coordinate a last-ditch plan. A massive energy salvo was prepared, intended to strike the center of the human network and disrupt their systems. But as the weapons fired, the projectiles slowed mid-flight, diverted harmlessly into open space, and dissipated without impact. On the Erebus, Admiral Calthor's face turned pale as he realized the extent of the impossibility. The humans did not simply counter, they rendered action irrelevant. Strategy, firepower, coordination, even luck itself, all were meaningless against forces the Trivax could not even perceive. Meanwhile, humans observed silently. Their fleet remained invisible, their presence undetected, yet everywhere. Ships moved without sound, without detection, ensuring that every collapsing vessel followed the exact path humanity had calculated. Not one unnecessary action was taken. Not a single life was harmed. No planet was scorched. No system destroyed. This was not vengeance. This was inevitability. Humans were demonstrating that true supremacy was not measured by aggression, numbers, or destruction, but by preparation, patience, and knowledge beyond the comprehension of even the most advanced civilizations. By the end of the second day, thousands of vessels had been reduced to driftwood, powerful, massive, and utterly ineffective. Crew morale collapsed entirely. Panic spread to every surviving vessel. Navigators whispered of ghost fields and impossible physics. Officers begged for explanations, but no answer could reconcile the impossible reality. 10,000 vessels, the pinnacle of Trivax power, had been neutralized without humans lifting a single weapon. Humanity's mastery of patience, foresight, and ancient technology had reshaped the battlefield before it had even begun. The galaxy itself seemed to pause, as if aware of the shift. The surviving vessels, now numbering in mere hundreds, drifted helplessly, their commands unheeded, their systems failing, their crews frozen in disbelief. Humanity had returned, not to attack, not to destroy, but to demonstrate something far more terrifying, a species that could orchestrate absolute control through patience, strategy, and knowledge older than the stars. The first true HFY moment had arrived. The Armada would never recover, and the universe had begun to learn a lesson it would never forget. Humans were inevitable. By nightfall, as the final operational squadrons struggled to maintain formation, the first reports reached other sectors. They are everywhere. They do not fire, they do not strike, and yet our fleets are destroyed. Fear rippled through the galaxy. Historians, strategists, and commanders all began to comprehend a terrifying reality. The humans they had dismissed for centuries had returned, and they had mastered forces the galaxy could neither fight nor predict. 10,000 vessels had been sent to destroy them. Thousands had already been neutralized, and humanity remained invisible, patient, and unstoppable. By the third day of the campaign, the devastation was almost total. The 10,000-vessel armada that had once seemed invincible was now reduced to 12 surviving ships, scattered across the outer systems, crippled and desperate. Every surviving crew member felt a creeping, suffocating terror, not from the humans' aggression, but from their absence, the invisible presence that had orchestrated the collapse of an entire armada without firing a single shot. On the bridge of the Erebus, Admiral Calthor's face was pale beneath the cold glare of emergency lighting. Systems flickered in incomprehensible ways, and data streams warped, showing impossible readings. "We've accounted for only 12 vessels," he rasped, his voice cracking. His officers nodded, their expressions taut with disbelief and fear. "Yes, sir. 12. That's all that remains operational. Every other vessel has failed or drifted off course. There's nothing left to fight." Attempts at regrouping were futile. The 12 surviving ships attempted to consolidate, to form a last line of defense, but the humans had anticipated every maneuver. Navigation channels, communications, arrays, propulsion vectors. Everything the Trivax relied upon had been subtly manipulated. The humans did not chase. They did not attack directly. Instead, they had turned the armada into a trap in which survival itself was impossible unless guided by unseen hands. In a desperate effort, the surviving admirals activated their fleet's remaining energy weapons, attempting a concentrated salvo to strike at the invisible human positions. Missiles flared from the remaining hulls. Energy beams surged into the void, but as if guided by some unseen force, each projectile deviated, slowed, or failed entirely. Explosions, where they occurred, were isolated and inconsequential. The humans remained unharmed, cloaked in fields older than any recorded star, projecting invisible barriers and manipulating the very physics of space around them. The crews of the 12 surviving vessels panicked. Engineers, navigators, and weapons officers tried everything: recalibration, manual overrides, rerouting power, emergency protocols, but every action was anticipated and nullified. What they believed were mistakes, malfunctions, or anomalies were in fact the exact outcome humanity had calculated centuries ago. The humans had studied their patterns, their strategies, their instincts, and they had prepared contingencies to counter every conceivable response. The last dozen ships were trapped, not by force, but by inevitability itself. Inside one of the surviving vessels, Lieutenant Mara Vesh gripped the command console, her knuckles white. "It's as if they know everything we'll do before we do it," she whispered, voice trembling. "There's no way to escape." Her commanding officer, Captain Ilrine, stared into the warped displays, his eyes reflecting disbelief and growing terror. "We've faced superior forces before. We've survived disasters. But this is something else. Something beyond comprehension." Meanwhile, humans observed calmly. Their fleet remained invisible, distributed strategically across the system, and perfectly synchronized. No weapons were deployed unnecessarily. No ships were lost. Humans had orchestrated the collapse of 10,000 vessels, yet the universe would remember not a single explosion or casualty inflicted by their hand. They did not act out of vengeance. They acted with precision, patience, and inevitability. One of the surviving Trivax ships attempted to flee the system, hoping that retreat would preserve life. Propulsion systems engaged, but the engines immediately faltered. Trajectories warped, sensors failed, and navigational outputs returned impossible vectors. The ship spiraled, helpless, and finally came to rest near the asteroid belt, drifting, incapacitated. The humans had anticipated the instinct to flee, and they had ensured that escape was futile. The lesson was brutal and absolute. No action, no matter how desperate, could circumvent the inevitability of human mastery. The 12 remaining vessels were finally forced to acknowledge the futility of their efforts. Each ship attempted to communicate, sending messages of surrender, confusion, or even defiance, but humans intercepted, rerouted, and observed silently. Their response was simple, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Nothing. No attack, no provocation, no reaction beyond patient observation. Humanity demonstrated that dominance was not measured in violence, but in the ability to control outcomes without engaging in conflict. Galactic historians would later record this moment as the event of 12, the collapse of 10,000 vessels into a mere handful, neutralized without loss of human life, without a single hull breach, without a conventional strike. It was a demonstration of foresight, strategy, and ancient technology older than the stars themselves. The galaxy began to comprehend a terrifying new reality. Humans were inevitable. Resistance was futile, not because of firepower, but because they had mastered the very art of inevitability itself. Within the Sol system, the humans' presence remained imperceptible. They did not gloat, nor did they parade their power. They simply observed, adjusted, and ensured that the final survivors would understand the consequence of underestimating humanity. The invisible fleet operated as if it were a single organism, calculating probabilities, predicting outcomes centuries in advance, and shaping the battlefield to ensure that the Armada's collapse was total. Admiral Calthor, realizing the futility of continued resistance, finally slumped into his chair, exhaustion and despair etched into every line of his face. His voice, barely audible, muttered, "We cannot win, not by fire, not by numbers, not by anything. They've seen everything we've planned and counted it before it ever existed." Across the 12 remaining vessels, a similar recognition spread. The humans had not fought, and yet they had won. The Armada's demise was complete. By the end of the 3rd day, the 12 surviving vessels had stopped all attempts at movement or combat. The humans had achieved a perfect demonstration of dominance. They did not need to destroy or conquer. They needed only to exist, to orchestrate inevitability, to ensure that the arrogance of the galaxy was met with patience, foresight, and mastery of forces older than the stars themselves. Humanity had returned, and with them, the galaxy learned a lesson it would never forget. Underestimating humans carried consequences far beyond comprehension. The event of 12 became the central narrative across the galaxy. Every empire, every fleet, every civilization took note of the unimaginable. Humanity had dismantled 10,000 vessels, rendered them useless, and controlled the outcome of the campaign without engaging in traditional warfare. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy recognized a species whose power was not measured by aggression or numbers, but by inevitability, patience, and intelligence that spanned centuries. Humans had returned, and they had already won without firing a single shot. As the final remnants of the Armada drifted silently through space, the galaxy began to absorb the implications of what had just occurred. 10,000 vessels had been dispatched to eliminate humanity, a species considered weak, insignificant, and long extinct. And yet, The armada had been reduced to 12 survivors, immobilized, powerless, and utterly defeated. No planets had been scorched, no civilizations obliterated, and no humans had fired a single shot. And in that silent, invisible triumph, the galaxy understood the terrifying truth: the humans were inevitable. Across the Trivax command network, panic became pervasive. Officers whispered in hushed tones, fearing that simply acknowledging the humans' mastery could bring them misfortune. The reports from surviving ships were chaotic, fragmented, but consistent. Propulsion systems had failed without cause. Weapons had misfired or become inert. Sensors were warped, and every attempted maneuver had been anticipated. The humans had not fought in any conventional sense. They had engineered outcomes. They had controlled space itself, or at least the perception of it, to render 10,000 vessels helpless. Diplomatic envoys from other empires scrambled to understand what had occurred. The Confederation of Orvaria, a neighboring civilization that had once prided itself on tactical supremacy, convened an emergency session of their council. Holo projections of the events in the Sol system played endlessly. The movements of the Trivax vessels analyzed in excruciating detail. And yet, even with every simulation, every calculation, every piece of intelligence gathered, the Council could not comprehend how a supposedly primitive species had achieved such an absolute victory without engaging in combat. It became increasingly clear that humanity's power did not lie in firepower or fleet size. It lay in something far older, far subtler, and far more terrifying: patience. Humans could observe, calculate, and plan across centuries. Their understanding of physics, of energy, of artificial intelligence, and of probability was unmatched, and it allowed them to manipulate outcomes before their opponents even understood the situation. They had waited silently, invisibly, allowing the armada to commit to its own destruction. The collapse was orchestrated, not chaotic, a masterpiece of foresight and inevitability. The 12 surviving Trivax vessels, drifting helplessly in the void, became unwilling symbols. Across the galaxy, their immobilized forms were analyzed, documented, and broadcast to every fleet, academy, and council chamber. They were a warning. 10,000 had been sent, and yet only 12 remained, incapacitated not by firepower, but by strategy and patience. Humanity had returned to the stars, and they had rewritten the rules of engagement, demonstrating that true supremacy did not require aggression, it required inevitability. Back on Earth, humans observed the aftermath with calm deliberation. There was no celebration, no display of pride, no revelry. Their fleets had done exactly what was intended: neutralize the threat without unnecessary destruction. The humans' technology, some of it older than the oldest stars, remained concealed, invisible, perfectly controlled. Their algorithms, their predictive models, their mastery of probabilities had executed flawlessly. And for the first time in galactic history, the other species realized that humans were not to be underestimated, feared, or dismissed. They were to be studied, respected, and understood. As reports spread, historians and scientists struggled to articulate what had occurred. They did not fight, yet they won. One historian muttered in disbelief. They did not fire, yet the armada is destroyed. Scholars attempted to dissect the human methods, but every layer of technology and strategy seemed deliberately designed to resist comprehension. Humans had leveraged forces older than known civilizations, structures that predated recorded history, and understanding that spanned beyond the galaxy's collective intelligence. Every calculation that could be performed only confirmed the inevitability of their victory. Meanwhile, the surviving Trivax crews, once proud, confident, and disciplined, faced a new reality. Their weapons, their training, their fleets, and even their ingenuity were irrelevant. They had been outmaneuvered, not by aggression. Survival itself had been a gift, not a right. The humans had demonstrated mercy in their execution, showing restraint even as they dismantled the mightiest fleet ever assembled against them. And yet, that mercy carried its own terrifying weight. No civilization could challenge humanity again without catastrophic consequences. Galactic colonies began to change their approach. Ships were recalled, fleets consolidated, and councils reconsidered every assumption about strategy and power. Humans were no longer a species to be ignored, dismissed, or underestimated. They had returned, not to conquer, but to assert their inevitability, and the galaxy had learned a painful, humbling lesson when humanity acted. The results were inescapable. The event of 12 became a case study, a warning, and a lesson in patience and foresight. Scientists across the stars attempted to reverse engineer the humans' invisible manipulations, but even with advanced technology, the calculations required were centuries in advance, beyond the capacity of any non-human species. Diplomats approached Earth with unprecedented caution, offering treaties, apologies, and concessions. The humans listened, observed, and did not engage unless necessary. Their return was not about war. It was about demonstrating mastery and control. And then, slowly, the galaxy began to whisper the truth. Humans were inevitable. Not because they were aggressive, or overwhelmingly strong in numbers, or technologically advanced in conventional ways, but because they had patience, foresight, and a mastery of forces older than the stars themselves. They had returned, had neutralized the greatest threat in history without firing a shot, and had shown that the universe itself bent to their strategy. The 12 surviving vessels remained a haunting testament to the humans' capabilities. In every command center, every fleet training program, every strategic academy, they became a symbol of what happens when a civilization ignores, underestimates, or dismisses humanity. The Trivax Alliance, once proud and confident, now existed under the shadow of that inevitability. And across the galaxy, the other civilizations began to realize that patience, foresight, and intellect could wield power far greater than fleets, weapons, or empires. Humanity had returned, and the lesson had been learned: underestimate humans at your peril, for they had rewritten the rules of the universe. By the close of the third galactic cycle, the event of 12 was no longer just a battle report. It was the moment the galaxy truly feared humanity. Every empire, every fleet, every strategist began to adjust, pause, and reconsider. The humans had not destroyed worlds. They had not annihilated civilizations. They had simply demonstrated control, patience, and inevitability, and that demonstration was more terrifying than any weapon the galaxy had ever known. Humanity had returned. The galaxy would never again make the mistake of dismissing them. 10,000 vessels had been sent to destroy them. 12 survived. The lesson had been delivered, and the universe had begun to understand, perhaps for the first time, that when humans acted, nothing could stop them. The galaxy had learned its lesson, but the humans had not acted out of pride or vengeance. By the fourth cycle, the 12 surviving Trivax vessels were immobilized, their crews shell-shocked, facing the incomprehensible magnitude of human mastery. Humanity remained unseen, silent, and deliberate. They did not gloat. They did not taunt. They merely observed, allowing the consequences of centuries-long preparation to unfold naturally. The surviving admirals convened one final time, transmitting what they believed would be a desperate plea. The transmission crackled through the void, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and fragile hope. We submit. We do not understand. We cannot fight what we cannot see. Humanity, you are inevitable. There was no reply, not because humans ignored them, but because no words were necessary. The message had been understood. The lesson had been delivered. Across the galaxy, civilizations began to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. The event of 12 was studied, documented, and analyzed. Military academies replayed the scenarios endlessly. Scholars debated the implications. Scientists tried to reverse engineer the phenomena, attempting to understand the invisible manipulation of space, energy, and probability that had rendered 10,000 vessels ineffective. And yet, every calculation only confirmed the humans' inevitability. Their victory had been not in aggression, but in patience, foresight, and a mastery of knowledge that no other species could match. Back on Earth, life continued, as always. Cities thrummed with normalcy. Scientists monitored distant star systems, analyzing data from the defeated armada. Families lived, unaware of the galactic transformation their species had just caused. Humanity had demonstrated that true power lay not in dominance or destruction, but in understanding, strategy, and foresight. The humans had not conquered, they had controlled outcomes, reshaping the galaxy's understanding of what power truly meant. The surviving Trivax vessels eventually drifted back toward the outer systems, their crews silent, traumatized, and forever changed. They would carry the story to their people, to the empires that had once dismissed humanity, to the councils that had believed the Sol system empty and insignificant. And when they spoke, every word would carry the weight of inevitability. Humans had returned, and the universe would never again make the mistake of underestimating them. Diplomats and envoys from distant civilizations approached Earth cautiously, offering alliances, treaties, and concessions. Humanity observed, measured, and responded with patience. They did not act aggressively, nor did they seek conquest. Their return was not about domination. It was about setting a precedent, a warning, and a new standard. The galaxy had assumed humans were extinct. It had assumed they could be dismissed. And now, every species had learned the cost of such assumptions. In the aftermath, the galaxy's military doctrines were rewritten. Fleets were no longer built solely for firepower or size. Strategies accounted for patience, foresight, and unseen variables. Leaders studied the event of 12 for centuries, realizing that a single species, underestimated for millennia, could alter the balance of the universe without engaging in traditional warfare. Humanity had returned, not as conquerors, but as masters of inevitability. The 12 surviving vessels became a permanent testament to human superiority in strategy and understanding. They were displayed as a cautionary tale across the galaxy, symbols of what happens when arrogance meets a species that has mastered foresight beyond comprehension. Every commander, officer, and historian understood the same truth. Humans were not just another civilization. They were a force that could not be countered, predicted, or defeated. Their mastery lay in preparation, patience, and the invisible orchestration of outcomes. By the end of the first galactic cycle following the event, humans began to extend subtle influence through diplomacy, exploration, and trade. No wars were waged, no planets conquered, no fleets destroyed unnecessarily. Their actions were deliberate, controlled, and impactful. The galaxy adapted to the presence of humanity, recognizing the species not as a threat in the traditional sense, but as an inevitable factor in every calculation of interstellar politics and strategy. The story of 10,000 vessels, reduced to 12 survivors, spread across systems, star councils, and academies. It became a parable of arrogance and humility. Generations of species would remember the event of 12, not just as a battle, but as a demonstration of the principle that true supremacy did not rely on aggression, numbers, or immediate power, but on mastery over time, knowledge, and foresight. Humanity remained on Earth, observed quietly by those who had come to understand the implications of their return. They had not sought glory. They had not sought revenge. Their purpose was simple and absolute, to demonstrate that underestimating humans was a mistake with consequences beyond calculation. And as centuries passed, the galaxy continued to respect, fear, and adapt to humanity's presence. The legacy of the event of 12 endured. Entire empires shifted their doctrines. Fleets were rebuilt with caution. Diplomacy replaced blind aggression. And in every corner of known space, the same lesson echoed. The humans had returned not to conquer, but to assert inevitability. 10,000 vessels had been sent to destroy them. 12 survived. And the universe would never forget that humans had mastered forces older than the stars, patience deeper than the void, and strategy beyond comprehension. And so, in the quiet of the Sol system, humanity observed, waited, and prepared. The galaxy had learned to fear them not for their firepower, nor their aggression, but for their inevitability. When humans acted, outcomes were certain. When humans decided, reality itself conformed. 10,000 vessels had tried and failed. Only 12 survived. And that, the galaxy understood, was merely the beginning.